Hello, welcome to the third most episode of Learn Your Own Rules, the podcast. That's right, this is episode number 3, which means it's going to be the best episode yet. And it's going to be the best episode because, you know, this is a lot harder than it looks. And so, with more practice comes perfection. This is a board game podcast about board games where we talk about gaming experiences, board games, and we do reviews, but we do so without explaining all the rules it takes to play a game. There are plenty of videos out there that will teach you how to play games, and they're going to do it much better than I can. So I will place links in the description of this podcast to videos that go more in depth in the rules for each game that I talk about. With that being said, today we're following the normal schedule where we'll talk about some games I've played recently or some experiences I've had. Then we're going to move on to the game of the week, which this week is trains. It's the fourth week of the month, and in the fourth week of the month, I want to take the time to talk about some of my favorite games. A lot of channels and podcasts do top 10 lists. That's not something I'm particularly fond of, and for one reason, because I'm bad at making them. So I guess you could treat the next 10 fourth weeks of months as kind of a quasi top 10 list, but these aren't really in any order. It's just whatever I feel like talking about for that week from my personal favorites. So this week I had a chance to play Stone Age. This is designed by Bernd Brunhofer, and it's published by Hans im Glück. Stone Age is in many ways a classic game. It was published back in 2008, and to many people this would have been most likely one of their first, if not their first, experiences in worker placement games. And so it has a legacy appeal to it. Unfortunately, I'm not one of those people that played this game back in 2008. I think our group picked it up just a couple of years ago, after we'd already been very familiar with a lot of different worker placement games. And so while I can see that this would have been a great game back in 2008 when worker placement games weren't as prevalent as they are now, nowadays I struggle to kind of figure out why I'd want to ever play it. It's not a game that's really aged very well. The first big problem is that it's incredibly long for what it is. You're making incredibly simple decisions, and the game lasts. I think our game was something around 2.5 hours at 4 players, which is way too long for this game. The second issue I see with it is the action spaces in the center, the town action spaces. They're so good that those are always taken first. And so when you're first or second player in a round, it's so rare that you're not just taking one of those spaces. It'll happen here and there, but for the most part, they're so in demand and they're so limited that those are obvious places to place right away. And I don't think any game benefits from having spaces as powerful as that, where they're obvious choices to be taking all the time. In a way, I think a little bit of Lords of Waterdeep. Frequently, the building space, where you get to build new buildings, is valued much higher than other spaces because there's so much reward for building new buildings and putting them out on the board. Even if you aren't the one visiting those places, you're getting passive bonus from other people visiting them. There's also the minor issue with luck playing a pretty prevalent role in the game. I'm not averse to dice rolling or luck in my games. It does seem like a strange marriage for a worker placement game, though, when frequently they're low to little luck, to have luck be so important in this game. And there's ways to mitigate it, but the biggest way to mitigate that luck is to use tools which are taken from those central action spaces. So it just emphasizes their use even more. But all things considered, for the game being what it is, for the game having the legacy that it has, I have a difficult time being too hard on it. And I still think it's a great way to introduce somebody to worker placement games. This game is slightly more complex than Settlers of Catan or Ticket to Ride or anything like that. And it's just a step above Lords of Waterdeep. And so I think it's a great introductory game for that. It's probably a great family game. I haven't played it with extended family or anything like that. But for anyone that's into medium and up games, this is not a game that you're probably going to enjoy very much. And that game is Stone Age. I also got a chance to play Dinosaur Island recently. Now, anybody that's watched any of my videos from when I was making video reviews, I did not care for Dinosaur Island. This is designed by Jonathan Gilmour, Brian Lewis, and is published by Pandasaurus Games. We realized we hadn't played Dinosaur Island in years, not since I released my reviews, and we actually have the expansion. I backed the expansion on Kickstarter, despite not liking the game, in the hope that maybe it would spice things up enough to make it an interesting experience. I'm sad to report that that was not the case. In fact, in many ways, it just expounds on a lot of the issues I had with the base game. One of my big issues with the base game was that there are a ton of upgrades you can get, but none of them are really all that interesting. And that's the case here as well. There are a bunch of modules that add a whole bunch of stuff to the game, but most of it really isn't very interesting. The only module that seemed to present any real interesting change to the game were the park executives and facilities module. In that module, you get access to a special executive meeple, which is basically a worker that has special powers. And unfortunately, just giving you one extra worker that gives you one special ability isn't really all that interesting. As for the facilities, half of them seemed like they were kind of interesting, the other half were very forgettable. And that's really all the expansion offered in terms of spicing up the gameplay. The marine creatures were a huge disappointment, which is a shame because those are the things I was looking forward to the most. But they almost struck me as an afterthought. They're horribly balanced to the point where in the couple games that we played, we had one where one marine creature just sat on top of the stack for the entire game because nobody wanted to buy a creature that gave no points and gave them a ton of threat levels, like 6. The Megalodon gave like 6 threat, no points, but a bunch of excitement. The problem is, can you ever afford to have, or do you ever need that much excitement that you're willing to take on 6 threat level? And don't even get me started on the blueprints. The blueprints are dumb. The blueprints are lame. I want a game that rewards me for creating cool combos, for doing interesting things. I don't want a game that's further constraining me and forcing me to build in a certain way in order to get the most points. And so I don't want to beat a dead horse, but Dinosaur Island, it was not for us, it was not for me, and I'm just gonna sell my copy because at this point I don't think we're interested in playing it anymore. And this is actually timely because the Dinosaur World Kickstarter just started, which it looks like it may be a more interesting game than Dinosaur Island, but I, for one, am not backing any more Pandasaurus game Kickstarters, and I can't really understand why people would want to with the way they've treated their backers in the past. So that was Dinosaur Island by Pandasaurus Games. I've also had a chance to play The Quest for El Dorado, which is designed by Heiner Knizia and is published by Ravensburger. This is a enjoyable, quick, and incredibly frustrating at times deck building game, where deck building is the core mechanic, but it almost feels like an afterthought a lot of the time. And it seems that way because deck building is almost feels secondary to the main game, which is moving across the board. As the quest for El Dorado is basically a race game, trying to get from one end of the board to the other. I like the quest for El Dorado. I've enjoyed my time playing it, but it's a game that frustrates me at the same time. Luck and variance is a unavoidable aspect of deck building games. Anytime you're shuffling a deck and drawing cards at the top, you often have little or no control over what you're drawing. And this is true even for the deck building games that I love. But most deck building games aren't a straight race the way that the Quest for El Dorado is. And it's not an enjoyable experience to be stuck behind another player and taking a whole turn to just do nothing because you happen to draw a handful of money cards. Now, you could argue that if you find yourself in that situation, you've done a poor job of movement, but it's important to remember that your movement is determined by what you've already drawn, what's on the board, and what you've had access to. And maybe this isn't the case, but it has been for us so far. There's a real big problem with runaway leaders in this game. Once somebody gets ahead, it is real difficult for other people to catch up. And part of that is drawing the right cards at the right time, part of that is choosing the right path, but either way, it doesn't always make for a very satisfying experience. I haven't had a chance to play any of the expansions yet. I'd be very interested in that. But as I've said before for other games, this is a quick enough game, and I'm talking 35, 40 minutes, even at 4 players, to where I have a hard time holding the frustration I sometimes have while playing it, holding that frustration against the game. It's a light, quick deck builder that I enjoy well enough, but almost hesitate to call a deck builder because it doesn't have that feeling of a deck builder. It doesn't feel like any of the Cryptozoic games or Thunderstone or Ascension or Dominion or anything like that. It's still a deck builder, but it doesn't feel like it while you're playing it. And so, yeah, that's Quest for El Dorado. Check it out if you're interested. Speaking of deck builders and moving on to the game of the day, Trains. Trains is designed by Hazashi Hayashi. It is published by AEG, and it was first released in 2012. Oh man, where to start with Trains? I love Trains. I love Trains so much, and I would play it at any potential opportunity. It is a game. Let me take a step back. It's hard to talk about Trains without talking about Dominion. Dominion was published in 2008, 4 years before Trains. And obviously, Trains is an iteration of Dominion. It utilizes many of the exact same mechanics. It's got the static market, 5 cards in hand, discard at the end of the round, spend what you can. But the key difference between Trains and Dominion is, of course, the board and the way you utilize that board to help you score points. But I will tell you that board makes a world of difference when it comes to a deck building game. And this is coming from somebody that's played games like Clank, other deck building games with boards. I've enjoyed Clank the couple times I've been able to play it, but Trains is the shining jewel to me in terms of this type of game. Honestly, I don't think there's anything mechanic wise about this game that I do not like. The way that waste is integrated is incredibly interesting. The way it bogs down your deck and slows you down, and the way that buying victory points cards does in Dominion. I love the variable strategies, the different ways you can go about winning the game. I've heard some people say that rushing buildings to score points is incredibly overpowered and always wins, but if anyone thinks that, you have not played with a group that is also rushing rails and stations. I would love to see somebody try that strategy against my wife, who seems to always have all 20 rail tokens or however many it is out on the board by like the 20th turn. It's the kind of game that balances itself based on the strategies people are taking throughout the game. And it reminds me of Resident Evil in that way a little bit, but I'll talk about that deck building game some other time. There's enormous variability in this game, especially once you pick up one of the expansions. I'm lucky enough to have them both, and the variability they provide is unmatched. That you definitely have to have at least one, in my opinion, if for no other reason than to have the alternate maps. Especially since the base game, the maps for are way too big for 1 or 2 players. For 2 players, there's the map is so big that for 2 players you might as well be playing solo and just trying to maximize your score because you're never going to meet each other unless you go out of your way to do so. And even for 3 players, that base game map is a little big. They're clearly ideal for 4 players, but the additional maps you get from the 2 expansions really improve the presence of the game and make it a much tighter fit for all players. And it's not only the boards that you want to focus on. The expansions also provide route bonus cards, which function very similarly to routes from something like Ticket to Ride. They are cards that give you a route you need to take from one city to another city. And if you can connect a route between those 2 cities, you're going to score bonus points at the end of the game. These route cards are, in my opinion, not just awesome, they are vital to the game experience. Sometimes, even with 4 players, you might have players that have a tendency to just kind of stick to their own corner of the map. But the route bonuses can be so important that it forces people to interact with others on the board, to spread out in areas they may not spread into normally. And so it increases your player interaction, which is something a lot of people really prefer. And it also just adds to your decision making a little bit. And have I mentioned this game is quick? This game is lightning fast. Anyone who's played a lot of Dominion could attest to the fact that you get a few Dominion players together that know the game really well, you can fly through a game so fast because everyone knows exactly what they're doing on their turn, and you can basically be taking your turns at the exact same time. And it's very similar for Trains here too. You get 3 or 4 people together that know this game, and you're cranking out a game in 35, 40, 45 minutes. It is lightning fast, which is great for a game with this much strategic depth in it. And I want to qualify that statement strategic depth. This is no Lisboa, this is no Terra Mystica, but for a light medium deck building game on a board, there is a whole lot of interesting decision making to be made on this board. It's impossible to completely block somebody out, but it's very possible to make it so costly for somebody to move into your area that you can effectively make it just not worth their while to try to move in. That's one of the ways that waste comes in is very interesting. The more you expand, the more waste you accrue, and the more waste you have, the more it slows you down until you have those sweet, sweet turns where you get to discard 4 or even sometimes 5 waste out of your deck entirely. I think the waste is also especially well handled in the buildings, the point buildings. Because when you purchase a point building, you get not just the building card that's worth points at the end of the game, you also get a waste card that goes with it. And those point buildings are basically point cards from Dominion. They sit in your deck, they clog up your hands, and they slow you down. So you're basically getting 2 cards that are going to slow you down over the rest of the game every time you buy a building. Whereas if you're just focused on the map, if you're just building stations and building rails, you're only gaining that waste as you progress across the board, oftentimes gaining more and more points. And so, yes, I love Trains. Really, I love Trains, and I'm always happy to play it. And I've only got one downside to the game, and that's that the theme is just about the driest and dullest thing I could possibly imagine. Now, if you're a train enthusiast, that's probably not the case. If you're a Japanese train enthusiast, this is probably going to be your favorite game in the world. But as somebody who's not a train enthusiast, I can absolutely understand the look of disinterest in anybody's eyes when I pop the game box open and show them what's inside. The card art is not interesting. The board is not interesting. The book is not interesting. The cover is not interesting. This is the definition of a boring theme. Honestly, in many ways more so than the Dominion theme. That's probably one of the most common criticisms that people have for Dominion is that it's got almost no theme. And while I would agree, personally I find a generic fantasy theme a little bit more engaging than some trains any day. It strikes me as a situation where you either like Dominion or you like trains. There's certainly room in your collection for both if you're interested in both, but I can see people who really prefer the high engine optimization Dominion being frustrated by trains because of the way waste bogs that engine down. Dominion strikes me as a game where you start off incredibly inefficient and then you work towards building an engine that ideally by the end of the game is just humming along really efficiently. Whereas trains is never going to be like that. Even with the best cards on the market to deal with waste, you're always going to be almost coming to a clunking finish at the end of the game. As you're trying to be the first one to get that last rail out, or you're trying to place that last station to score you some more points. This is not a game of engine optimization, but instead, it's a really great game with some really strong player interaction that I could absolutely recommend to anybody looking to get a great deck building game. This is a game that I would recommend to just about everybody, even new board gamers to an extent. This may not be a game you pull out to play with grandma who only likes playing Bridge and Rummy Cube, but this is a game that anybody could pick up and anybody could learn. And I've had success teaching it to people who aren't gamers, to people who have played few games, and to people who are hardcore gamers. I've had people of all spheres really love this game, and so I would recommend checking it out to anybody who's looking for another deck building game. And that is going to do it for this week's episode of Learn Your Own Rules, the podcast. Thank you so much for listening. My name is Ryan Krim. If you'd like to reach me, you can email me at learnyourownrules@gmail.com or you can tweet me at LYORules. It's of course our favorite day, Friday, which means a great weekend, so I hope you get to go out and play a bunch of games. And as always, game on. Thank you for listening to the Learn Your Own Rules podcast. This podcast is created, produced, directed, and edited by Ryan Krim. Please send help.